If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another discography ranking for you guys. It's been a little while since the kind of iffy ranking I did for Mayhem, but that was mostly down to me being sick when that video happened and I had a deadline. I might end up redoing it one day. I don't know. We'll see. But here I am, back 100% and ready to go to do a discography more justice. And for this discography ranking, I am going to be talking about all 11 studio albums from arguably the most consistent death metal band in the history of the genre, and that is, of course, Immolation. Yeah, this is one I've been looking forward to doing for a while, but also somewhat dreading because I'm going to go ahead and say, next to Death, probably the most difficult discography I have had to rank so far, just because all 11 albums are fucking great in their own rights. It's just perhaps either due to memorable songs or production issues, and also just tastes kind of determined how I ranked all of these albums. So that's a little kind of pretext for everything that's going on for this video. But without further ado, as far as how I got into Immolation, well, this kind of goes back a little bit to when I was first getting into death metal, like, you know, in later years in high school, like my sophomore, junior, senior year, already getting into like Death and Cannibal Corpse, Morbid Angel, and Obituary and Deicide. So I was already pretty much well-versed in like the big bands of death metal, but I didn't come across Immolation until watching the Cannibal Corpse Centuries of Torment documentary, where both Ross Dolan and Robert Vigna were in the documentary because they're great friends with Cannibal, and I thought, you know, I might want to check out this band Immolation, but I kept forgetting about it until watching some compilation videos, countdown videos that had Immolation songs, and I was like, you know, this is actually really fucking good. And then just over the course of the next several years leading up to now, gradually got more and more into Immolation, but I didn't go head on into everything Immolation until doing this ranking. And needless to say, I'm a much bigger fan of Immolation now, and it's like, wow. This was definitely difficult, but with all that said, let's get into the history of Immolation. So, we begin in 1988, where guitarists Robert Vigna and Tom Wilkinson both disbanded a band they had in '86 called Rigor Mortis. Not the Texas Rigor Mortis that absolutely kicked ass, but yeah, these two had a band called Rigor Mortis in Yonkers, New York, and pretty much broke up in 1987, 1988, in that time frame. So, but Robert and Tom wanted to keep making music, but they wanted to find new people to play with, or some friends that they wanted to be in a band with, but couldn't until now. So they would get drummer Neil Bobak and bassist and vocalist extraordinaire Ross Dolan. And this would be the early original lineup of Immolation for the first couple of years. And then I believe somewhere in 1990, Neil ended up leaving the band, and in walks drummer Craig Smolowski, who is a hell of a drummer in his own right, I would say. But yeah, this would be the early recording lineup for Immolation for the next several years. And did a demo or two somewhere in late 1990 and so on and so forth, and even playing the Day of Death Festival in Wisconsin in 1990, which pretty much kind of exposed more death metal bands to more people all around the world, and also with tape trading and everything, word got around about Immolation pretty much worldwide, and they decided that they wanted to do something a little bit different in the death metal world, and that's get a little more gruff and a little more evil sounding. Not to the extent of a band like Morbid Angel or Deicide, but something of their own. And Also, on the strength of playing Day of Death as well as a demo, they ended up getting picked up by Roadrunner Records, which, again, this was back when you can trust Roadrunner, and they were actually a great label. Nowadays, Roadrunner is a shell of what it used to be. But I digress. So they end up going to Roadrunner Records, and instead of doing what was becoming the norm in American death metal, which was a lot of bands going down to Tampa, Florida, at more sound studios to record, instead, these guys flew all the way across the pond to Germany to work with one Harris Johns, who is a legendary producer who worked with bands like Sodom, Creator, Voivod, Coroner, and Pestilence, and pretty much it was inspired by all those bands and those albums as to what led Immolation to going over to work with Harris Johns. Even Ross Dolan will admit, Sodom, listening to like the late 80s, early 90s Sodom material, inspired Immolation to work with Harris Johns. And Harris liked what they had to offer, and off to the races we go. And in the studio in 1991, and then released in 1991, we get the debut album, Dawn of Possession. This is definitely, I would say, one of the best debuts in death metal history, and this was really part of that explosion of the second wave of death metal that began here in 1991 with all of its giant releases that came out in 91. This is definitely among the best of 1991 death metal. Now, as far as my ranking, it's my number 2 album. For a long time, it was my number 1, but it fell to number 2, but it's still absolutely brilliant. Dare I say, this album has a little bit of a black metal vibe, like, because there are some real cold tremolo riffs, and as well as some of the blackened blast beats, not the typical blast beat you would hear in death metal. You got more blackened blast that you would hear in black metal bands, but this is still very much old school death metal, but with a bit of a blackened touch. Honestly, you could call this like a proto-blackened death metal album as well, and like you could hear tropes from this album in like modern blackened death bands of today even. But yeah, tracks like Into Everlasting Fire, Desponded Souls, the title track, Burial Ground, After My Prayers, Fallen Disease, the song Immolation. But for me, the big standout was Those Left Behind. That song, I feel, kind of presented everything Immolation was at this point and what they would become. Lots of dissonant riffs, atonal riffs, some triplet chugs. Basically everything you love about like dissonant, atonal, but also old school death metal with triplet chugs and some other aspects going on. And even the vocals for Ross Dolan were a little bit different on this album. Like, they had a little bit more of a guttural approach. Not to the level of a guy like John Tardy or Joe Ficek or anybody like that, but something of his own when it came to his own brand of guttural vocals. And I think he only really did this approach on 1, maybe 2 albums. But overall, this is a fantastic debut, and it's my number 2 overall for Immolation. So they would go on touring all over the place for the next few years, like in America, even going over to Europe to do some touring. Although some shit happens in record labels and they wound up no longer on Roadrunner Records. But they would eventually get picked up, thankfully, by Metal Blade Records, which kudos to Metal Blade for picking these guys up for a few albums. And, well, because of all this chicanery that happened with Roadrunner, I don't know if they purposely took the time in between the first and the second album or it was being delayed. I'm not sure. But it took them 5 years to release another album. This will be the first of 2 times where we get a 5-year gap between albums. But we retain the same lineup of Ross, Robert, Tom, and Craig, but a different producer. We get Wayne Dorrell to be the producer, and again on Metal Blade Records. And released in 1996, we get the follow-up, Here and After. This is my number 3 album. I think in terms of a follow-up to a debut, this was a great follow-up. It's just only at number 3 because I just like a little bit more of that raw approach on Dawn of Possession a little bit more. But when it comes down to songwriting, this album, I think, kind of steps it up songwriting-wise. Like, the opening track, Nailed to Gold, does feel like a leftover cut from Dawn of Possession. It has some of those blackened feels, a little bit of a thrashy feel. But most of the other tracks on this album kind of focus more on groove, but also little hints of doom. Like, dare I say, probably the doomiest that Immolation ever sounded was on Hereinafter, with songs like the title track, Towards Earth, Under the Supreme Christ Cage. I Feel Nothing, I would say, is one of the best Immolation songs. Certainly one of my favorites. It's got some... It's weird. It's dissonant and atonal, but yet there's something catchy about it. And the drum flair from Craig, like, he puts on a hell of a performance on this song. I've even tried to play it, and it is hard to kind of keep up with all the different tom fills that Craig does, as well as the constant double bass and the double time on the ride. It's a tough song to really master, but still, top to bottom, this album's just packed full of evilness and aggression, and yeah, great follow-up to a great debut, my number 3. So, they would go on to tour for the next couple of years on the heels of Hereinafter. In fact, I remember seeing in the Cannibal Corpse documentary, they did do a tour with Cannibal as well as Marduk. And from all that counts, it was a pretty successful tour for all three bands. Now, they would eventually go back to the studio in 1998, so a lot quicker of a time frame to get back to work on new material. And then, of course, during the Hereinafter tour, really after Hereinafter was done, Craig Smilowski would leave the band, and in would come Alex Hernandez on drums, and he'd be the drummer for the next few albums. But yeah, they would get back to the studio in 1998 and begin a long-standing relationship that stands to this day with producer Paul Orfino, who has been the producer pretty much ever since. And released in 1999, once again on Metal Blade Records, we get Failures for Gods. This album fell in the ranking. This is my number 9. Although I do think the songs are great on this album. However, the big issue I have, the production. Paul didn't do that great of a job. Then again, it was his first go working with these guys, and it kind of started off a little bit rough. Like, the vocals and the drums were, like, really up front in the mix. The guitars get really buried. But some people might like this album for that reason. I do like the songs, but the production, not the greatest. I'm not saying it's like the worst production I've ever heard, but definitely not a good production. It definitely does kind of hold this album back. But the songs are absolutely great, like Once Ordained, No Jesus, No Beast, the title track, Stench of High Heaven, Your Angel Died, The Devil You Know. Again, top to bottom, great songs, no bad song, but the production does kind of ruin it for me a little bit, and hence why it fell all the way to number 9. But it doesn't mean it's not a kick-ass album. It does kick ass. If you can get past the production, I think you'll dig this album when it comes down to the actual songwriting construction and the way the songs are themselves. But the production does kind of hold it back, and that's why, I should say, is my number 9. Now, they would tour for a little bit on Failures for Gods throughout 1999, heading into 2000, but they would pretty much get right back to the studio in 2000. Once again, Paul Orfino on the production helm, and they wanted to kind of fix the errors that occurred on Failures for Gods and really get the production right. And I need a drink of water for this. Because this next album, they wanted it to sound bigger, they wanted it to sound evil, but yet still retaining grit. Released in late 2000, we get Close to a World Below. This is my number 1 album. It was definitely like a coin flip between this and Dawn of Possession for me, but just, oh my golly. This album is just packed full of hit after hit, but it's still very evil sounding, like, and that's really kind of the big thing. Like, everything Immolation does has an evil tone to it. It's just in the way it's approached might be a little bit different album to album, but here, I've heard some people say this album's muddy. I completely disagree. I think this is a well-produced album, but still retaining grit and that evil brutality that Immolation are known to really project. Kicking things off with Higher Coward. Father, You're Not a Father was, I think, the first Immolation song I really got into, and it's a phenomenal song, one of the best songs they've ever written. And just, again, top to bottom, every song is absolutely amazing. Put My Hand in the Fire, which was actually the shortest song of the album at a little over 4 minutes, definitely made me think of Morbid Angel, which then again, there are some occasional Morbid Angel vibes all across this discography. After all, if you go to Metal Archives, to like both Immolation and Morbid Angel's pages, they're like very, very close, like in the second or first place spots on each other's similar artist sections of each other's pages on Metallum or Metal Archives. So yeah, definitely some Morbid Angel vibes do come through on several recordings, but the title track, Close to a World Below, such a mammoth monster of a song. It builds up very well, it pays off very well, you get pretty much every ingredient in Immolation's catalog, and that's the atonal riffs, the dissonant riffs, groove, little hints of technicality, and dark melody. And that's always been kind of like a sneaky secret weapon in Immolation's musical arsenal, is bringing in little dark melodies into their songs to like really enhance the sinister nature of these songs. And the song Close to World Below was like the perfect encapsulation of everything Immolation is all about. But yeah, this album, top to bottom, phenomenal. One of the best modern death metal albums to ever listen to. Even in 2000, where he had a lot of big releases, this was definitely among the best. But yeah, my number one. So, they would tour for a little while heading into 2001. However, original guitarist Tom Wilkinson would end up leaving the band, which kind of left Immolation in a bit of a bind at this point when it came down to like, okay, we need another guitarist, who can we get to fill out this tour? Well, they would pick up someone perhaps some people would not expect. They would get John McEntee from Incantation, which of course, I can't believe I've gone this long in this video without mentioning Incantation, because there's always been like this big competition between Immolation and Incantation as to who is the better death metal band out of the two. And some people might think, oh, these two probably hate each other. Absolutely not the case. In fact, John's a big fan of Immolation and good friends with the guys, and the fact that he would help them out on a tour pretty much should seal the deal that there is no real rivalry between these two bands. It's all just fan feuds when it comes down to these two bands. But yeah, and even like at some points, Immolation could sound a bit like Incantation or vice versa. They do have some similar influences when it came down to songs, although I will say Incantation's a little more cavernous and a little more doom-laden. But of course, I'm just nitpicking there. But yeah, just cool that they got John to do a little tour in 2001 to help out his buddies. And then after that portion of the tour was over, they would pick up future long-standing guitarist Bill Taylor, formerly of Angel Corpse, to step in as second guitarist, and he would remain in the band for about 15 years, starting at this point on. Now, also, after Close to a World Below, the tour ended, they were no longer on Metal Blade Records. Their contract was pretty much fulfilled. But they would get signed by Listenable Records for the next few albums, so they've been fortunate to still get big-time labels to support them. Whether or not you would consider Listenable to be a high-standing label now, that's your interpretation. I say yeah, because for a European label, one of the best. And they would get back to the studio in 2002. Excuse me. And then released in 2002, their debut on Listenable Records, we get Unholy Cult. This is my number 5 album. I will say, like, the production got a little bit better when it came down to, like, making everything sound bigger. However, the snare, and that's kind of an issue with a few albums in Immolation's catalog, the snare sound, not the greatest. But the guitar tone, still retaining that evilness from Close to a World Below, but making it maybe a little bit beefier, if that's possible. But again, Paul Orfino as the producer, like I said, producer pretty much going forward. But yeah, some absolutely great songs on here. Martyrs and Men, Sinful Nature, the title track, Reluctant Messiah, Kingdom Divided. Just, again, top to bottom, brilliant songs. It's just only at number 5 just because there are just other albums I like a little bit more. But this is, I would say without a doubt, when it comes down to 2002 traditional death metal albums, the best one that came out that year. And even one of the best album covers that you'll see in Immolation's entire back catalog, like with that church and the cross and the clock. Like, I mean, I would pull the album cover out behind me, but this fucking stool likes to squeak and squeal. But yeah, this is an absolute killer album, and for Bill Taylor's first outing with these guys, he delivers. Like, he's very much on par with what Robert does when it comes down to riffage and songwriting. But yeah, my number 5. Now, after Unholy Cult and after the touring was finished, the band kind of went through a couple of different transformations. First, Alex Hernandez would end up leaving the band in 2003, and in comes Steve Shalati, fellow Ohio native, and still is the drummer in the band to this day. And as much as Alex Hernandez kicked ass on the kit, I like Steve's approach a little bit more when it comes down to fills and cymbal accents and turnovers. So I think this was a bit of an upgrade, I would say, when it came down to drummers. Now, the big transformation was in the lyrical content. Like, as you would know, throughout the first 5 albums so far, from Dawn of Possession through Unholy Cult, the lyrical themes were definitely more anti-religious and atheist lyrics, or atheism, and very much like evil sounding, but not overly satanic. However, they would end up changing their lyrical approach for the most part going forward, and part of the inspiration for the lyrical change was what happened on 9/11. Basically, Ross Dolan and Robert Vigna have talked about how that moment not only changed the world, but also changed the way they were going to approach their lyrical content and talk more about society and political stuff, like divisions between people, and just kind of tell dark stories about all that. And some people might not like that kind of approach. I don't mind it. It still retains musically Immolation. It's just in the lyrical themes and the stories they're telling now are completely different. But they would change up the lyrical approach going forward and would return to the studio, I believe, sometime in 2004, and then released in 2005, we get Harnessing Ruin. Now, as I said, Immolation, one of the most consistent death metal bands of all time, and all of these albums are really good to outstanding. But when it comes down to ranking, something has to come last, and in this case, Harnessing Ruin is my number 11. It's my last place album, but it's still really fucking good. Really what it kind of boils down to, again, the lyrical approach, it was just starting that transition, so maybe they needed more time to really kind of get everything going when it came down to their new, like, lyrical vision. But also the production kind of felt a little bit thin in the drums. Like, the guitars still are rich, even though I'd say maybe they were a little bit thinner than on Unholy Cult, but really it's the drums kind of sounded a little bit thin. But aside from that, again, really good tracks on here, like Swarms of Terror, Our Savior Sleeps, Challenge to Storm, the title track, My Own Enemy, Crown the Liar. Again, really good songs, but the production kind of regressed from Unholy Cult, and also with the new lyrical approach, needed perhaps a little more time to really fine-tune what they wanted to do lyrically, and it kind of maybe felt a little bit abrupt. But still, musically, really solid stuff. It's just only at number 11 because something has to come in last. There can only be one number 1 and one number 11, so that's just more or less the way it is. But still, check it out. Now, they would tour for a little while on Harnessing Ruin and then return to the studio, I believe, sometime in 2007, and then released later in 2007, we get Shadows in the Light. This one's my number 10. I think the production got a little bit better. The snare still sounds a little bit thin, but it's better than it was on Harnessing Ruin. The guitars kind of get a little bit more beefy, but still not quite to the level of like Close to a World Below or Unholy Cult levels of beef. But still, I would say in terms of the songwriting, got a little bit better, and as well as like the lyrical approach, got a little more fine-tuned on this album. Songs like Hate's Plague, Passion Kill, World Agony, Deliver of Evil, the title track was probably the big standout for me. It's got so many cool melodies in there. Not pretty ones, evil ones. And, of course, Whispering Death was a really good closer. Like, again, no bad tracks. And, yeah, really trying to get everything going in terms of the lyrical direction, and also trying to get the production back to the levels of the early 2000s material. But yeah, my number 10. Now, again, touring ensues, and I apologize for that. But yeah, more touring ensues, as well as their appearance in the Cannibal Corpse documentary. But they would end up leaving, or the contract was up with Listenable Records, and then they would get picked up by Nuclear Blast Records, where they still remain to this day. And kudos to Nuclear Blast for picking up these guys, because, yeah, great addition to an already legendary label. But they would get back to the studio, I believe, sometime in late 2009, early 2010, and then released in 2010, we get Majesty and Decay. This is my number 6 album. I will say, in terms of production, we're about to run into an era of the next few albums where the production sounds giant but still gritty. Like, I would say, like this, as well as the following 2 albums, some of the best production in the entire Immolation back catalog. Like, the snare sounds big and fat with a PH and just, it sounds like fucking hammers pounding on your temple, but in a very musical way. And of course, the guitar tone got even more beefy on this album. Like, Bill and Robert, again, just shredding and providing some awesome riffage. Songs like The Purge, the title track, one of my other favorite Immolation tracks, Inhuman Form, A Glorious Epoch was a very good standout song with like these cool evil melodies that kind of bring an atmosphere somewhat to the songs. Rapture of Ghosts, Comfort of Cowards, top to bottom, absolutely brilliant stuff. It's Immolation done to a fucking T, but with a giant production and just still sounding evil and gritty. Like, don't think because I'm saying the production's gigantic that it's too polished. No, it's just clean enough, but still gritty enough to feel like human beings actually did this. But yeah, Majesty and Decay, huge debut for them on Nuclear Blast, and in the upper half of the Immolation catalog, my number 6. So, more touring ensues, because that's what this band is all about. Write, record, tour, and just killing it when it comes down to tours and albums. They would eventually get back to the studio, and then they would actually get a little bit of extra help when it came down to production. Paul Orfino still is the producer, but for the engineering side, they would get current Haunted guitarist and YouTube sensation Ola England to step in to help engineer this album. And released in 2013, we get Kingdom of Conspiracy. This is my number 8 album. This is a worthy follow-up to Majesty and Decay. Like, the production, I think maybe got a little bit cleaner somehow on this album, and I think that was primarily down to, like, Ola's vision when it came to engineering the production and the mix and everything. So it does have a little more of a cleaner tone, but it still sounds evil. But yeah, there are some really cool, like, triplet chugs. Like, of course, triplet chugs have always been there, but we start getting them a lot more in the more recent albums. Like, the title track, you get this really cool triplet chug section with, like, these big, like, atonal and dissonant riffs, just mashing it all together. But other songs like Keep the Silence, God Complex, The Great Sleep, Spectacle of Lies, All That Awaits Us. And it's like, most of these songs were more kind of compact. Like, they were more they were shorter than most Immolation songs, like in between the high 3 minutes and the low 4 minute range. But they were able to pack enough in that time where it doesn't feel like it's lightweight. It feels like it's done right. And even the longest track, The Great Sleep, at almost 5.5 minutes, absolutely kicks ass. So yeah, top to bottom, a great follow-up. It's just only at number 8 because I don't think it was as good as Majesty and Decay, and then there was one other album I thought was just a little bit better. But still, phenomenal album, and it's my number 8. So, again, more touring ensues, and a lot of stuff going on in the Immolation camp. They would go back to the studio in 2016, however, long-standing guitarist Bill Taylor would end up leaving the band, and interesting choice for his replacement, who's still in the band today, former Chorophobia and Incantation guitarist Alex Books. And Alex was just in Incantation not long before joining Immolation, so kind of an interesting thing there. But yeah, Alex Books, second guitarist, great guitarist, and works very well with really anybody he plays with. So this would be the lineup going forward to right now as of recording: Ross Dolan, Robert Vigna, Alex Books, and Steve Shalati. But yeah, they would return to the studio in 2016, and then released in 2017, we get Atonement. This is my number 4 album. Holy shit. This album, when it comes down to the production, great mix of, like, that snare. Again, the snare sound is huge, but the guitar tone has a little bit more grit than even on the previous 2 albums. Like, it's got a more gritty guitar tone, which is really cool. And, of course, all these songs rule. Fostering the Divide is another one of my favorite songs, with, of course, starting off with, like, these really cool atmospherics and, like, drum moments from Steve, and then into, like, this evil, dissonant, doomy riff, and just really getting downright nasty. But other great ones like Rise to Heretics, Thrown to the Fire, Destructive Currents. Lower is a really cool song that has much more atmosphere going for it. The title track, Power of Gods. And on special editions of this album, you get a bonus track where they do a re-recording of the song Immolation from Dawn of Possession, and it's a really cool version. So yeah, top to bottom. And this is also one of the longer albums, too. It's like almost 49 minutes. So yeah, they were definitely pushing themselves in terms of the amount of songs. Like, well, not including the re-recording of Immolation, 11 tracks. So yeah, they were definitely starting to push themselves when it came down to how many songs they can come up with, as well as creativity. But yeah, Atonement, I would say in the era of having the more inner struggle, societal, political lyrics, this is probably the best work, at least in my opinion. Great blend of everything Immolation's all about, but with gritty guitars and a big drum sound. So yeah, my number 4. So again, more touring goes on for these guys, and of course, you know, touring for the next couple of years, and then of course 2020 with the pandemic hitting kind of delayed them really doing anything else. But then once they were able to get back to a studio in 2021, they would finally get to work on another visceral onslaught of an album. And then released in February of 2022, we get the latest and last Immolation album to date, Acts of God. I actually reviewed this album when it came out over a year ago, and I gave it, I think, a 9 out of 10, and it made my top 15 on my year-end list. For the ranking here, it's my number 7 album. Some people might think it's maybe a little too high, considering this is a new album, and it's 15 tracks, and this is the longest Immolation album in the entire discography. It's over 52 minutes. But every song, even the 2 short minute-plus instrumental interludes or intros, were really well done and tasteful. But yeah, songs like An Act of God, Noose of Thorns was a big standout, Shed the Light, Blooded. Overtures of the Wicked kind of brings back a little bit of like the early Dawn of Possession sound with the blast beats and the almost thrashy approach a little bit. Immoral Stain, Incineration Procession, When the Halo Burns, Apostle, which was the first single, but the closing track, such a big evil song. And this also lyrically kind of brought back a tiny bit of the anti-religious lyrical themes, but not as much. It's like it's just peppered in on a couple of songs like An Act of God and When the Halo Burns and songs along those lines. And this album almost feels like an amalgamation of the first two albums and Close to a World Below. Like, it feels like a mashup of those three albums. Although, again, the snare sound regressed again. Like, it sounds thin, but it's still audible, but not as audible in the mix compared to the guitars and the vocals. But still, the album as a whole, great addition to the Immolation discography, and it's my number 7. And that, ladies and gentlemen, does it for my Immolation ranking. Like I said, arguably the most difficult ranking to do next to Death, just because no bad albums. Every album's really good to outstanding, and Immolation proven to the world why they are one of the most respected bands in the entire death metal genre. And even black metal bands like Marduk look up to a band like Immolation, so goes to show you how far their influence is felt across metal as a whole. And of course, one of the longer lasting death metal bands in terms of putting out consistent albums. And of course, the two men that have held it together, Ross Dolan and Robert Vigna. Amazing musicians. In the case of Ross, a great vocalist. And when you hear his voice, you know it's Ross Dolan. But yeah, phenomenal discography. I'm a much bigger fan of these guys now, and I can't wait to hear what they have in store next time. But of course, that does it for this Immolation ranking. How would you guys rank the Immolation discography? Let me know in the comments below. And as far as what's going to be my next ranking, it's going to be probably tail end of June, maybe early July. I'm going to be covering the almighty Iron Maiden. And that one's going to be interesting considering they're one of my all-time favorite bands, period. And to go over, I believe, 16 or 17 studio albums, it's going to be a challenge. But yeah, I can't wait to dive back into more Iron Maiden. But anyways, thank you guys for watching this video. Keep your horns high and your dreams wet.